So can you all see my screen? Yes, fantastic. So I am delighted and honored to welcome today Professor Tim Ingold. Tim Ingold is Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. His doctoral work was conducted at the School Sami of Northern Finland, studying their ecological adaptation, social organization, and ethnic politics. Tim Ingold taught at the University of Helsinki and then at the University of Manchester, becoming professor in 1990 and Max Gluckman professor in 1995. In 1999, he moved to the University of Aberdeen. His interests are wide-ranging and his scholarly approach is individualistic, at least if I follow what is written on Wikipedia. They include environmental perception, language, technology and skill practice, art and architecture, creativity, theories of evolution in anthropology, human-animal relations, and ecological approaches in anthropology. So many topics we covered in the context of the Dauphine Phenomenology workshop. In his recent work, he links the themes of environmental perception and skill practice, replacing traditional models of genetic and cultural transmission, founded upon the alliance of neo-Darwinian biology and cognitive science, with a relational approach focusing on the growth of embodied skills of perception and action within social and environmental context of human development. This has taken him to examining the use of lines in cultures and the relationship between anthropology, architecture, art, and design. Writing within the anthropological realm of phenomenology, Tim Ingold explores the human as an organism which feels its way through the world that is itself in motion, constantly creating and being changed by spaces and places as they are encountered. Today, he will talk about phenomenology in writing and details an argument at the heart of his postscript, the beautiful postscript he wrote for the Oxford Handbook of Phenomenologies and Art Studies that you can find page 719 in the handbook. So Tim, the floor is yours. Again, it's an honor and pleasure to welcome you for this talk.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really grateful and honored to be with you. And I bring you greetings from the University of Illinois, where I'm currently visiting. So it's your afternoon, but I'm here at 9 o'clock in the morning. So there is no scholar for whom writing is not an inescapable everyday chore. But in view of this, I find it surprising how little thought we have given to the phenomenology of writing itself. And I mean by that the actual bodily practice, for example, of writing with a pen on paper or of tapping on a keyboard and watching the letters and words appear on a screen. There seems among scholars to be almost a tacit agreement that at the end of the day, the only things that really matter are the words that end up on the page or the screen, never mind what form they take or how they got there. And perhaps that's why we so often accuse our words of being disembodied, insisting by the same token that truly embodied experience must be non-verbal. And yet, we write as much as we speak from our bodies, just as spoken words well up on the breath, written words pour out from the micro gestures of the hand. Isn't it as much in the devotion that goes into their performance as in their semantic content that the meaning of our words resides? So I wonder whether a phenomenological approach taken to its logical conclusion would bring writing back into the very presencing of the world, rather than, as in the customary expression, the written word, consigning it to a past that is over. Instead of the written word, perhaps we should talk about the writing word, the word that is on the cusp of its appearance. Well, students of anthropology about to embark on their first major project of research have often approached me with questions along the following lines. I have been reading your work and really sympathize with your phenomenological approach. I would like to apply it in my own research, but tell me, what would adopting such an approach mean for my practice? What difference would it make for the way I should do my fieldwork or write up my findings? And I've always found these questions hard to answer, nor are answers easy to come by in existing literature. We all know that in studying among people whose background and experiences may be very different from ours, the task is not to interrogate them with pre-prepared questions answering to our personal agendas, but rather to observe what they do and listen to what they have to say, and to learn, as far as is practically possible, to learn to perceive things in ways that correspond with theirs. It's not then by directing our questions at people that we gather our material, but by joining with them, such that their questions become ours as well. And in this, we willingly forego the comfort and security of established positions, leaving us exposed and vulnerable. But by the same token, we render ourselves open and attentive to life as it comes. Now, I think much the same advice might be offered to any aspiring phenomenologist. It would be to treat the world itself as a milieu of study, not to confront it from a position of objectivity and detachment, but rather to embrace it as the very matrix of one's thought and practice, and to place one's trust in experience. We could indeed be forgiven for concluding that what anthropologists customarily call participant observation, or its textual rendering as ethnography, is no less than a method of phenomenological research. So then I wonder, have we anthropologists, when we say we do our research by participant observation, by learning and listening from the people we work with, have we anthropologists been doing phenomenology all along? Well, some have, of course, and have explicitly identified themselves as students of phenomenological anthropology. But they're a minority. Most have not. And I would have to count myself initially among the latter. Because as a student, I had never even heard of phenomenology. I can't remember exactly when I first encountered the term, but at the time it meant nothing to me. It struck me as just another instance of scholarly obscurantism. Phenomenology, I mean, whatever next? My own interests, stemming from a background in the natural sciences, were in ecological anthropology, in which a key question was to relate the meanings and values people assign to constituents of the world around them to the configuration of facts on the ground. I was very scientific, very positivistic kind of researcher, and dissatisfied with the conventional idea that human environments are culturally constructed, I was looking for an alternative, preferably a bit more scientific. Well, at first I found the kind of approach I was looking for in the ecological approach to perception that had been pioneered in the field of psychology by James Gibson. For Gibson, meaning lies in the discovery of what an environment affords, that's his term, what an environment affords for living beings in the course of their current activity. And it has its source not in the mind, in any capacity to organize sensory inputs from the exterior world in terms of the concepts and categories of a received tradition, but in the relations set up by virtue of the presence and activity of the being, indivisibly mind and body, in its environment. And one of the attractions of this approach for me was that culture, so problematic for anthropologists, culture could be taken out of the human ecological equation, allowing us to understand how even non-human animals can inhabit meaningful worlds, even if they are not endowed with the imaginative capacities that enable humans to represent and reflect on what they perceive. And yet something was still missing, because Gibson had put all the movement on the side of perceivers as they actively explore and seek out the affordances of the environment, while treating the environment itself as a domain of insensible objects that have, as it were, precipitated out from the currents of their formation and are already laid out like the scenery and properties of a stage set, waiting for perceivers to make their entry. I wanted to find a way to think about the perception of the environment that would situate perceivers, whether human or non-human, in a world that was not yet fixed, but continually coming into being around them. Because any inhabited environment, it seemed to me, is always work in progress. And if that is so, I wondered, then what's the difference between the ways humans and other animals make themselves at home in the world? It can't be that, well, animal constructions are dictated by instinct and human ones by designs of the intellect, when in practice, the forms of these constructions are not transferred ready-made onto the material, but emerge from ways of working with environmental materials in the labors of building. Construction arises within inhabitation, I thought, or building within dwelling, not the other way around. Someone, I think a visitor from architecture, suggested that I should read an essay by the philosopher Martin Heidegger entitled Building, Dwelling, Thinking, in which he had made precisely this point. I read the essay, and while I found much of it incomprehensible, his remarks on building and dwelling struck a chord. Not for the first time, I found I had blundered into an immense field of philosophical inquiry of which I had previously known nothing, not by design, but simply because it had already wormed its way into my thinking without my really noticing it. Imagine my dismay then on discovering that this was the field known to philosophers as phenomenology. This word that I knew nothing about and that was incomprehensible suddenly turned out to stand for the very position I had found myself in. This word, which had once seemed so abstruse, suddenly took on a new meaning. I had never set out to be a phenomenologist, let alone to apply a phenomenological approach. But now I seemed unintentionally to have landed in the thick of it. And what's more, the problem that had taken me there, of understanding how form and meaning arise from the practical and perceptual engagement of living beings within a dynamic and sensate environment, turned out to be the centerpiece of one of the most important texts ever written in the field, namely Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. So belatedly, I would dip into it, coming away with inspiration every time I did. I've never read the Phenomenology of Perception from beginning to end, and I rather doubt whether anybody else has. My usual tactic is to open it at random and read a few pages, and you always find some ideas and inspiration coming out. This is the way with these enormous books of French philosophy. They don't start from a beginning and work through an argument and come to an end. They start from the middle of nowhere, carry on for several hundred pages, and then stop. So you can't read them in a linear way. It's more like it's more like a landscape that you can take a walk here and take a walk there and see what you come away with. So that's how I've tackled Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. So I would dip into it, coming away with inspiration every time I did. But my phenomenology is nevertheless homegrown. It doubtless takes untold liberties with canonical works. Textual exegesis is a task for trained philosophers, not for amateurs like me. But one of the peculiarities of these philosophical discourses is that even as they extol the existential condition of being in a world, they absolve their authors of ever having to dirty their hands with it, or to put their thinking at risk of contamination by any visceral contact with real life. There's a story that's told about the Victorian anthropologist Sir James Fraser, author of the classic book The Golden Bough, all about the superstitions and practices of savage and primitive people. The story is that he was asked whether he had ever met any of the savages that he wrote about, to which his response was, "Heaven forbid that I should have such a misfortune." And I sometimes had the same feeling with phenomenological writers, that they write all about being in the world, but would rather not be in the world themselves if they can possibly help it, so that they can get on with their very abstract thinking and writing. So it often seems that phenomenological writing is so wrapped up in itself as to evade all commerce with the world whereof it speaks. So that's why, after all, I remain an anthropologist and not a philosopher. I still believe that the best way to fathom the depths of human experience is to attend to the world and to learn directly from what it has to tell us. And this, of course, is what inhabitants, the people who actually inhabit this world, this is what inhabitants do all the time in their daily lives, and they have much to teach us. Even to begin to resolve the crisis in our relations with what we used to call the natural world, but increasingly today the planet, we need to listen to the wisdom of its inhabitants, both human and non-human, rather than taking shelter in the closeted self-referentiality of philosophical texts. And that takes me back to where I left off a few moments ago, as a novice anthropologist, knowing nothing of phenomenology, yet immersed in the everyday life of the people among whom I was carrying out ethnographic fieldwork, carried out as part of my doctoral studies in social anthropology. I was living in a remote corner of northeast Finland. It was in 1971 to 2, among Sami people who drew a living, among other things, from herding reindeer, fishing, berrying, and occasional wage labor. And in the copious field notes I compiled at the time, I did as I had been told by my supervisor and wrote down everything I could remember that people had told me and what I had observed. The advice was, write everything down, because you won't know until much later on what might turn out to be important and what might be of no significance at all. So put down everything. Now, even after the lapse of 50 years, these notes remain a treasure trove of information. And yet you will search them in vain for anything of my own personal experience. It had simply not occurred to me then to describe what it felt like to walk the paths through the forest in summer, or to ride a sledge in winter, or to handle a lasso, or to fish through the ice, or to stuff my reindeer skin boots with hay, or to inhale the smoke of a log fire, or to share in the pool of light cast by a paraffin lamp, or to witness the full moon of an Arctic night. These things certainly left an impression, and I would tell of them in letters home, but they never made it into my field notes, because I had been taught to treat field notes as a repository of objective data for future analysis. So what wasn't in the notes would fall through the cracks. So if in the fieldwork practice of participant observation, I may have unwittingly followed a phenomenological approach, then it was in the simple activity of note-taking that I began to diverge from it. Nor was I alone in this. Many anthropologists have told, albeit informally, of how the experiences that left the greatest impression, that proved the most eye-opening, and that transformed them personally, sort of happened in between, while they were gathering information on other things. I think it was John Lennon who wrote that life is what happens to you while you're doing other things. It's this same idea. Now, the importance of field notes cannot be overemphasized, but not for the reasons usually set out in formal protocols of academic research. According to these protocols, as I had been taught, notes are to be deposited or archived as data from which I would go on to build my analysis. And this is still how they are officially regarded. It is a problem nowadays because anthropologists are expected to deposit their field notes as data in electronic repositories so that other researchers might be able to use them later on. And this poses all kinds of ethical problems, but again rests on the premise that what's in the notes are the objective data, nothing of the subjective experience of the researcher themselves. So in that sense, anthropological field notes differ from the kinds of data handled by other sciences only insofar as they're said to be primarily qualitative rather than quantitative. But in practice, as I found for myself, field notes actually serve a quite different purpose. They work in effect not as an archive, but as a time machine. Actually, something like what Erin Manning, the philosopher, has recently called an anarchive. The archive is putting things down, sort of on the shelves in layers. The anarchive is always bubbling up. And that's what field notes do, they bubble up. So they work as a time machine or an anarchive, or more precisely, they allow us to inhabit two times simultaneously, allowing the two times literally to bleed into one another. Memories fade, and events that seemed unforgettable at the time all too soon dissolve into a haze, never to be recovered. And this has been the Achilles heel of many an anthropologist who has thought in the field that, oh, I won't bother to write this down. This experience is so vivid, I will never forget it. Until 2 years later, they're sitting in their office trying to remember what was it that happened and find that they've got nothing there. So that's why it's just so important to write everything down, not because it's there as data, but because when you reread one's notes, even after a lapse of years and in an environment far, far removed from that in which they were first written, it is as if it all happened only yesterday. So you can sit in your study in the university or in your attic at home trying to write your article or your thesis, and what was going on there in the field, a completely different part of the world, a completely different situation, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, it's as if it happened only yesterday. And you can be in these two places at once, in your study and in the field at the same time. Even the bare facts serve as mnemonics, bringing people and places, sounds and smells vividly to mind. So every fact in your notes turns out to be less a record of the past than a kind of door that opens up to it, making it possible to relive past experience in the here and now. So notes are the seeds of memory. So returning to the question with which I began, the question often put to me by students, what difference would it make to adopt a phenomenological stance? In the field, you would still be a participant observer, and you would still write notes. There would still be information you need to collect, but you might perhaps choose to dwell more on your own experience, what it felt like, and on all the things that went on in between. You might write an altogether more personal account, closer perhaps to what otherwise would go into letters home. Now, for many contemporary anthropologists, this is already accepted practice. The field has changed a lot in the 50 years since I was doing fieldwork back then. And of all the changes that have taken place in the discipline over that period, none is more significant than the so-called reflexive turn, which demanded explicit recognition of the complicity of field workers in the situations they study. With this, the objectivity born of detachment was no longer an option. Now, this was an important step it was an important step to acknowledge that the visceral involvement of the researcher as a knowing and feeling subject in the social world of those among whom they study is not a weakness, but the singular strength of anthropological research, in that it opens observation to a truth beyond the facts, a truth in experience. And yet, despite this turn towards self-reflection, anthropology has not entirely escaped the straitjacket of formal protocols. But it's not until after fieldwork that the difference really shows. Now, just as a mountain only looks like a mountain when you observe it from a distance, so what anthropologists call the field only appears as such when you are not there anymore. While you're there, well, it's simply life in around some place. For there to become the field, you have to kind of wrap it up retrospectively into an account. Then the lines along which life is lived, including the lines of writing in your notes, become more like boundaries within which it is enclosed. And this is what happens when notes are turned into texts in the production of what we call ethnography. I think it's above all at this moment, when you forsake the immediacy of being there for the security of the study, that anthropology really tends to part company with phenomenology. It's a moment that heralds an abrupt change of key. Indeed, it's so abrupt that it can take months for the researcher to adjust to it. It's often remarked that a researcher recently returned from fieldwork is too close to the material to be able to write about it. It's just too intense, too vivid. They have to achieve a certain distance, to put all they have been through into perspective, to come to terms with it. So what had once been vividly present is now recalled in its absence, and the openness and exposure and vulnerability of participant observation gives way to the work of consolidation. And with that move, field notes become data for analysis. They were not data to begin with. Now, I have myself always written notes by hand and would advise anyone to do the same, even though digital alternatives are now available. I would also advise them to draw. Both handwriting and drawing answer, in the gestural movements of their accomplishment, to the generative movements of the phenomena that capture their attention, in a way that simply cannot be achieved with the punctuality of the keyboard. To write by hand, as to draw, is to unite questioning, observing, remembering, and imagining with the sensuous engagement of the hand with pen or pencil and paper. And what remains is the trace of the gesture. But the datum is something else. Where the trace is made in movement, the datum is a stoppage. So to treat one's field notes as an archive of qualitative data means, I think, reading them in a way that is contrary to their true nature. Indeed, I think the very idea of a qualitative datum enshrines a profound contradiction. Surely the quality of phenomena can be judged only by opening them to immediate sensory experience. In a word, it's a function of presence. And it's with the qualia of presence that phenomenology, of course, is primarily concerned. But for precisely this reason, it does not deal in data, because to render phenomena as data, they must be absented, closed off, severed from the relational matrix of their generation. Or as I suggested at the beginning, the writing word becomes the written word. Now, this contradiction in the meaning of qualitative data lies at the heart of ethnography, because in turning notes into text, prospect becomes retrospect. To describe one's encounters in the field as ethnographic is to imagine that even then, in the course of going forward with others, in activity and conversation, one is already, so to speak, in the future, looking back. It's as though you meet somebody and you're having a conversation with them and you're already thinking, I'm going to write this up. So you're thinking yourself in the future, looking back on an event, even as in the moment of its unfolding. And when anthropologists talk about the ethnographic encounter, and you think what makes any encounter ethnographic rather than anything else, it's because of this double standard in the retrospective stance that is embodied in the encounter itself. So when you're talking with others, it's as though you're already in the future looking back. Why else should so much emphasis be placed on the establishment of rapport? This word rapport carries an interesting double meaning of both friendship and report. You have a rapport with somebody, you're good friends with them, but you're going to report on them all the same. So it construes the field worker as a double agent, a kind of spy, sidling up to the people in a spirit of conviviality, only to convert what they learn from the encounter into intelligence on which to base an account. Even today, now that the ethnographer is no longer expected to hide behind a cloak of objectivity, but required rather to position their own presence and experience center stage, the ethnographic imperative remains. Many have taken to describing their practice as autoethnography. But to my mind, autoethnography is an entirely bizarre idea. I mean, there is a well-established genre of writing in which an author reflects on their life and times, and it's known as autobiography. So by what ruse, then, does bios, that's the life that can be told as a story, become ethnos? How does autobiography become autoethnography? It amounts, in effect, to a presentation of the ethnographic self as not just a subject, but a super subject who has taken on the mantle of an entire people, an ethnos. In truth, I think super subjectivity and hyper objectivity are two sides of the same coin. Heads, all you see is the ethnographer. Tails, all you see are the people. Now, the reflexive turn may have flipped the coin heads up, but it does nothing to resolve the opposition between the two sides. Now, a phenomenological approach, I think, promises to do just that. And it does so by acknowledging a priori the inescapable condition of our existence in a world which binds us into a matrix of relations even before any questions of objectivity or subjectivity can arise. Life can be transformative, but as beings in a world, the transformations we undergo are part and parcel of the world's transformation of itself, of its worlding. Certainly, worlding has suddenly become a fashionable term in discourses these days, but it was originally used by Heidegger in one of his essays on, I think in the essay on the thing. So the way to get at this is to think of ourselves not as nouns, that is subjects or objects, nor as pronouns, such as we, you, or they, but as verbs. As a verb, what you do is also what you undergo. Consider what happens, for example, when you go for a walk. Initially, it's something you intend to do, but once having set out, you and your walking become one and the same. Even as you walk, your walking walks you. You're inside it. With every step, you're a slightly different person from whom you were before. And if this is true of walking, then it is surely equally true of writing. After all, what's the purpose of writing, if not to allow readers to join in your deliberations, to open a path that they too can follow? And I think this, at the end of the day, would distinguish a truly phenomenological writing from the more conventionally ethnographic kind. Ethnography is writing about. It draws on what the people in your study have told you for what it tells about them. Here, lessons learned in the field become data for analysis, and what readers encounter is the final outcome. Phenomenology, I think, calls for a different way of writing, a writing with, which welcomes others into the space of our deliberations, as the hand holding the pen scours the mind for every next word. This is to join our own lines with the writing of the world, whether with the paths of human inhabitants as they find their ways around, or the tracks of animals, or the meandering vegetation. And just as our minds mingle with the world in writing, so the minds of readers mingle in turn with ours. And all these lines of living, thinking, writing, and reading are braided in a meshwork which ravels and unravels as it goes along. And in this way, life as scholarship doesn't progress towards a conclusion, but carries on. And phenomenological inquiry, as I understand it, is dedicated thus to the continuity of life. And I'd like to conclude in a sort of slightly humorous way by referring to what I think is perhaps one of the greatest classics of what we could call phenomenology in writing. It's a storybook for children, which is extremely popular in Britain. I don't know about its translation in French or other languages. It's called We're Going on a Bear Hunt. And it tells the story of a dad and his young kids who've decided as a day out that they're going to find the bear who's living in a cave far away. And they go through a field of wet grass, they cross a river, they stumble around over the roots in a forest, they go through a snowstorm that goes whoo woo as the wind blows. And every time they go through the grass, which went swishy swashy, and they went through the mud, which went squelch squirch, and they went through the snowstorm that went whoo woo, and they went through the forest, which went stumble trip, stumble trip. And after each of these adventures, each page, it says, saying, encounter the river or the snowstorm or the forest. We can't go over it. We can't go under it. Oh no, we'll have to go through it. Squelch, squirch. It's wonderful. And that, I think, with a full dose of onomatopoeia is perhaps what phenomenology in writing is really all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Tim, for this deeply inspiring keynote. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, comments, remarks about your work which resonate deeply with a lot of people I know here, and methodological, theoretical, philosophical questions they have. Maybe to launch the discussion, to start with the first question, because I don't see for the time being hand raised and I cannot see the Framapad yet. You insist in your postscript and in your talk about handwriting and drawing, sketching, reaching an embodied relationship with the description of field work. But on the other hand, the world we live in today, the digital world we live in, is based on keyboard, tablets, fingers just sliding. So isn't it a danger in your invitation at some point to reach kind of a cut with ordinary life as is experienced by many young people and many of us today in your invitation?
You're quite right, and this is something that worries me a lot. I mean, my own view is that I believe very strongly in the importance of handwriting, and that it allows us to move freely between handwriting, drawing, sketching, without crossing any kind of. It's not like moving between text and image. You don't ever have a feeling of crossing some great boundary. You can move backwards and forwards between writing and drawing, or something in between, and it offers a huge expressive potential, and it seems to me that to throw out that potential, to lose it, would be a tragedy of immense proportions. And I worry, for example, that in schools in many countries these days, young kids are not even being taught to write by hand because they're told that that's obsolete. They just go straight onto the keyboard, and I think this is a tragedy of similar proportions to imagining a future world in which we no longer have song, and which the lullaby, the lament, the opera itself are declared obsolete, because all that matters is that the word should be there and properly comprehended. So so the first answer would be we need to do everything we can to campaign to bring the handwritten word as well as drawing back into everyday practice. Some might say that there are ways of doing this, drawing on digital technology, that there's designs now where you can, for example, draw on a tablet or something like that. But I don't think it's the same, and I can't see the point of elaborate digital developments that will bring us back to what we could do anyway perfectly well without any digital resources at all. I remember when my university suddenly decided that they were going to get rid of all their all the blackboards we used to have and install extremely expensive whiteboards in their place on which you were not allowed to write except with special pens and everything. And said, what? And I remember arguing, why spend all this money on doing something that eventually enables us to do what we could do anyway very well with chalk on a blackboard. But maybe the master argument that we can adduce in this campaign is one of environmental sustainability. It seems to me that that the digital revolution is manifestly unsustainable. It requires huge consumptions of energy. It requires satellites in space, rockets, heavy metals. It produces piles of toxic waste. I don't see it lasting more than 150 years. That'll take us from 1980 to 2130. So we already have to think about what a post-digital world would be like. And it should be one that, if we're at all true to our environmental principles, should not require external energy power sources and be able to use simple raw materials that are available locally, namely pen, pencil, paper, whatever surfaces we want to use. So I think that's the master argument that we can use to bring handwriting and drawing back into the center where they should be.
And as I do not see yet another question, the problem is that I have potentially a lot of questions. But the second question I would have, it's about this notion of whiz and whizness. It's a notion I could not translate in French, whizness, that kind of thing. So you said that you were more interested in writing with than, in a way, writing about or for. But let's think about Descola and Achua Indian and the work he did. Maybe today, if he came back, they would be more interested in writing something for them about their suffering, their problem, than with them. I mean, at some point, the process of writing may demand that you yourself become a spokesperson for those suffering. Or so, how do you negotiate this shift between writing with, for, about? How do you feel
it's
the
not
boundaries?
The same as writing. It's not the same as writing for. I thought of it in the concept that I've tried to develop to deal with this is one of correspondence, almost in a Baudelairean sense, of correspondence, meaning like in a conversation, going along with others and responding to them as you go. So in music, for example, in a choir, there'll be the different melodic lines sung by the alto, the soprano, and the bass, and each is carrying along its own line, but becoming what it is through an answering in counterpoint to all the others. So I'm thinking of withness on the model of musical counterpoint, or more broadly on the model of conversation. So that the way I want to think about it is could be the anthropologist and the people, but or any other sort of situation, that you become part of a conversation, and that conversation doesn't have any natural boundaries. It can grow and grow and grow, and more voices can always be added into it, so that eventually it's a conversation that binds all of us on the planet. It's all one conversation, but has so many strands, and nobody can be everywhere in it at once. But I'm thinking about it that way. That one of the things that anthropology can do is to make it possible for others to join the conversation whose voices wouldn't otherwise be heard. So it's not that we speak for them, but we do what we can to bring them in, so that they can also become part of that conversation that involves all of us about how we're supposed to live. And I think that for me is what anthropology does that most other humanities disciplines don't quite do. I mean, certainly not disciplines like psychology or economics or history, is that they are still saying, we're going to study some people, but we want to tell you all about them. what they think, what they do, what they did historically, and so on, but we're not actually going to let them in to our scholarly conversation.
Good. Jenny, I think you have a question. Sorry.
Yes, I have. Thank you so much. My question actually, it connects to what you just spoke about, because I'm very intrigued by this, in particular when you said towards the end to write through something, and also to write through with others. Of course, that's fascinating. I was thinking of what kind of skills would we need as researchers? I'm thinking of, for instance, if you would create a PhD course, teaching next generation. What would that, what would we do?
The answer is I'm not actually quite sure. I think we need to do a lot of experiments to try things out. Between 2013 and 2018, just before I retired, I was running a big project funded by the European Social Research, the European Research Council. It was called Knowing from the Inside. And part of it was to try and do experiments along these lines. We had research students in as part of the project, postdocs as well, to try and experiment with different ways of doing this, to find out what might work, what writing might be, what other forms, such as even things like song, as well as drawing and various kinds of what we just bracket as artistic activity might work. I don't think we've completely solved the problem, and maybe it's insoluble, but I think if we would simply could move to a situation where part of doing a PhD, for example, is to try things out along these lines, that would be a step in the right direction. I wouldn't want to prescribe an outcome and say, no, this is what you have to do, rather than that. It's probably not in the spirit of the enterprise, but I do think we desperately need to break with the Byzantine conventions of academic writing that oppress most PhD students.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, just to think of the dissertation, the manuscript as including various kinds of attempts and experiments, like you say, that would be beautiful. That would be something very different. Also for the reader to engage with, of course.
Yes, absolutely. And that would mean that the reader could be involved in the process him or herself. And so that's the way one would like to go, but it's very hard. I mean, in that project where we had PhD students and they were confronted with this contradiction between what they would really dearly love to do, but that's all very well, but they also need to get their PhD so that they can have a career afterwards. And they really struggled with this contradiction. And they shouldn't have to. That was what I was feeling, that it shouldn't be like that.
Yes, Sylvia, please.
Hi. Well, actually, I was enjoying the pleasure of the silence because I was resonating so much with what Tim was saying that I was jumped to participate in this conversation, to join with my experience. So my experience is, first of all, not only to write, but to write with a pencil, because it's even a different thing, but this is a small thing. What I wanted to say, continuing the conversation about writing with, in the last year, I'm, so to say, theorizing about affective ethnography, saying that affective ethnography is not to write about affect, but to write from within affect. And I don't know if there is a difference, maybe not, but is also something that continue with doing research, is experimenting with the other, experimenting with ourselves, and also trying to see how how what we do, how our research practice transform ourselves in the process. So how we get out as a different person.
Well,
that's it.
So,
Thank you.
It's so nice to see you, Sylvia. Thanks for joining in. And your point about writing from within affect is just it. And so it's something. It means that when we're writing, we really feel it. That we feel an intense emotion, you might say, when that it's an emotional practice, and we to the question that then comes up is, are we really trying to be poets? Because you might, if you spoke to a poet and you said to the poet, what the whole point about is to write from within affect, I guess the poet would say, absolutely. I mean, that's what I do in my poetry. That's what it's almost a definition of poetry, is to write from within affect, rather than write about it or stand from the outside. And so my feeling is intuitively that there shouldn't have to be a contradiction or a tension between writing from within affect and writing in a precise and scholarly way. That it should be possible to find a way of writing that is both precise, scholarly, critical, that does the kind of things that we would expect good scholarship to do, but that at the same time is writing from within affect. That it is driven by that sense of involvement, as opposed to the sort of sterility of the academic who writes in a way that they would prefer not to have any visceral contact with the words at all. I mean, there's a sort of academic writing, I think, that treats words rather like a surgeon treats his instruments. They should be absolutely sterile lest they cause any infection. And an academic writing is rather like that. It sets up a sort of cordon sanitaire around the thing it's writing, so there's no possibility of cross-infection from the researcher to the research.
Maybe just to add a little bit of controversy and to play a little bit the advocate of the devil in this discussion, in the context of another event, we also had the great chance to have Bruno Latour, who was not that enthusiastic about phenomenology and who had maybe a different vision about the importance of writing and so on. That was interesting. He said, I don't want to betray what he said because it's not a precise memory, but at large, he invited us more to look in the direction of art-based ethnography, network-based, and in a way he said something like, writing, it's always adding lines, and the general line is too straight. So I would be curious how you feel the difference between yourself and what Latour says about ethnography, phenomenology in writing. Do you feel real differences, or am I just too polemical for the pleasure of being polemical?
There are real differences. I'm never quite sure to what extent there are differences of style or of substance. There's definitely a difference of style, and we come from completely different backgrounds. He from social studies of science, working in laboratories. Me from field work with Sami people. I mean, you couldn't imagine a more different starting point, and I think that naturally means that we tend to approach things in different ways. I've always found Latour's writing stimulating, yes, but also profoundly irritating. I don't know why. It's partly because he's sort of he's a bit showing off, but also it's very hard to deal with it critically, because he'll say one thing on one page and then something completely different on the next, and you never quite know what he's meaning. And so we had a big, not a bust up exactly, but we had an argument about lines years ago. Not a public argument. It was just in a discussion in between other things, and he was trying to say that that it sort of mathematically it makes no difference if you say let there be 2 points A and B connected by a line P, and let there be 2 lines A and B which intersect in a point P. So mathematically these are equivalent. And I said, yes, I know, but in my terms they're completely different, because as soon as you've taken a living being which lives along a line and condensed its being into a point and then connected up those beings as point-to-point connections, you have done something to life. You've put it inside, you've enclosed it. And that's what happens. That was the difference between my idea of the meshwork and his idea of the network. He couldn't see what the difference is, and I was trying to explain what it was. And it comes down to taking a living being and treating it as one node in a network, rather than a path, a line of experience. And for him, it didn't matter because he doesn't like phenomenology. But if you're into phenomenology, then you couldn't possibly collapse the life of a being into a point and consider that as linked to other points in a network. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work ecologically, and it doesn't work phenomenologically. So that rather sort of technical issue about how we understand lines and points, it sounds technical, but it actually underlies what I think is a pretty fundamental difference between us. And why in the end I found his kind of network analysis profoundly unsatisfactory and actually unecological. So yeah, we do have I think the differences are substantive as well as stylistic.
I'm very sorry about the technical situation, which is a very cold technical situation with 3 different contexts. Are there any other questions or comments? It's a great chance to have Tim with us today. I know that many of you would love to ask questions. Maybe they are too shy.
Actually, before they do, can I just there's one thing I remembered relating to Sylvia when she said that she always writes with a pencil, and I wanted to mention that. I mean, this is I always have a notebook for thoughts, and which is this, and I always use a pencil specifically for this, not for other things, but for this, because and a particular kind of pencil that took me a long time to find. This is a cheap pencil. It's plastic. You can get it from the shop for £5 for about 10 packet of 10. But there's some crucial requirements. That it has a rubber at the top, so that then you can rub things out in your notebook, and that's why the pencil is so handy. And it has a 0.7 millimeter tip, not the 0.5 millimeter tip, because the 0.5 breaks all the time, but 0.7 is just right. And the great advantage of this system is you don't have to bother with a pencil sharpener all the time. It took me ages to find exactly the right thing, and then this is a perfect artifact for notes. I recommend it.
Yes, Jenny, you want to ask a question? Sorry.
Yeah, I have another question actually, which is also related to writing, but more in terms of constructing arguments. Because I think in some of your texts, you seem to, use what we could think of as you put up 2 notions up against each other, in like creating some kind of dualistic view in a sense, we have this, and we have this, and then you discuss them against each other. That seems to be kind of a strategy you use for constructing arguments. And I would like to ask you, because one could of course criticize that, creating a black and white thing. But I would like to ask you then, so what do you see, what's the main you would say, you know, what is it that we can win from constructing arguments in that way?
Well, I agree. I do always do that, and it's a deliberate strategy, and I've sort of trained myself into it. So it's difficult to do things differently, and I train my students into it too, and say that this is the way to do it. Set out two different approaches, find out where they're really, what it is that they're really different about, what the points of contention are, and then see whether, on the basis of some body of material, you can come out with something that is either that this or the other, one side or the other is better, or that come out with something else altogether. And I simply find that it's a productive way to work, and one of its advantages is that it helps one to pinpoint fairly precisely where the actual matters in contention really are. I mean, that the alternative is you bundle people up as to this ism and that ism, and you have endless text saying comparing this ism to that ism, this person says and that person says, and somehow it doesn't move on, because once back as where are they, what are they actually arguing about, and saying the same thing in different words, or saying the same thing, different things in the same words, or where's the problem, and the precise I mean, the rule is that you have to, when setting out the two opposed views, you have to do so with a degree of sympathy. So imagine you imagine that you're a protagonist of one of these views. So not to start off from the start saying, well, obviously they're wrong, but to imagine, suppose they're right, and you try and present them as in as cogent a way as you possibly can, and then try and go from there. It seems to me that that's actually not a bad way to proceed. It's generous. It gives the respect that is due to people who've gone before you and tried to argue about these things. And when I've explained it to people, I've actually compared it to the sonata form in music, where, and the musical analogy sounds a bit more nicer, you know, it doesn't sound quite so argumentative, but in a sonata, you have the first subject and you have the second subject, and then they're repeated, and then you get into a development phase in which they work on one another to produce remarkable and effects that you might not have imagined when you set out. I mean, if it's a really interesting piece, then it turns out that when these two subjects work with one another, they create something beautiful that you wouldn't have anticipated from either of them on their own, and then that brings the thing to a conclusion. So I thought about it that way and said, take sonata form and adopt that into writing an essay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Antonio, you have a question?
Yes. Thanks for your speech, which was very, very fascinating, Tim. And my question is this: for me, when you were speaking, there was a lot of poetic speaking. I cannot say poetic writing, but I can say poetic speaking, even though you were reading a text. So it could be also poetic writing in a sense. What place has aesthetics in your ethnography?
Thanks. For a long time, I completely avoided the word aesthetics. It was partly because I couldn't work out what it meant. I'm interested in perception. I mean, that was what I was working on, and what I was writing on. I was studying how people perceive their environments and trying to work out a good way to look at that. And when I couldn't see clearly how questions of aesthetics would go beyond the questions of perception I was already interested in. I couldn't see exactly where the difference lay. I found when people were talking about aesthetics, they'll be talking about, oh, that's what I mean by perception. So I couldn't see where it came in until I began to address the question of imagination, because I've been writing all this stuff about perception, and critics would say, well, this is all very well, I like what you write, but where do you put imagination in all this? And I would say, I really don't know, because I haven't worked that out. And then I just actually put together a fairly recent collection of essays called Imagining for Real, which I tried, well, I've got to deal with this. And so I've tried to figure out what to do with imagination, where to put or really, what is the relation between imagination and perception? That was the key question. I don't know whether I've got a singular answer to it, but at least I've tried to address that question. And then I found that once you pose that question, what is the relation between perception and imagination? That is the question of aesthetics. I realized that's what it was, and the reason why I hadn't been talking about aesthetics up until then was that I hadn't really been properly addressing that question of the relation between the two. So now these issues of aesthetics have been coming in, but when it comes to just writing, people keep telling me that it's very poetic, and I think, well, if that's the case, heaven forbid, what's happened to the rest of the writing? I'm just trying to write well, I think, and writing well is a craft, and it's kind of musical. I mean, if I read something out, I'm writing something and I read it out, what I've written, and if it sounds somehow wrong, there's something wrong with the intonation or the rhythm or the prosody, I know there's something that needs to be fixed. So that somehow I'm thinking of this writing as if it was being read aloud, and where somehow the rhythm, texture, sonority is rather important to what you have to get across. And I think all good writing is like that, and most writers would probably say so, but for some reason it hasn't percolated through to academia, so I would just think that I'm not writing poetry, but I'm just trying to write well, and if we call that poetic, it shows that so much writing there's so much really bad writing about, which is a problem we need to address.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Because if there is no, maybe I can ask a kind of a concluding question. No, that's very frustrating to end this discussion. But no, so let's ask this question. So you know that the topic of this workshop is anti-phenomenologies. So we want to make it part of the discussion with people like Deleuze, who was not that friendly and sympathetic with the phenomenological argument. How do you view this anti-phenomenological argument in the world of ethnography, ethnology? Is it really a different camp? Isn't it a way to build a conversation? I know that Deleuze is also part of your own universe. So there is Merleau-Ponty, there is Deleuze. You make it in a way, I don't know if it's the right word, compatible, or you create a conversation which is generative for your own work. So how you do see this people who built a philosophy in a critique of phenomenology? Is it a different camp in your old world, ethnography? Is there a way to make all this generative?
I think I don't really want camps. I just want to go back to the idea that there are scholars, there are people here who in each one is trying to write something and work things out for themselves and find the right language to do it. And we all have our own languages, so that, you know, even within phenomenology, there's a world of difference, as I understand it, as something of an outsider to it, between, say, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, and then you'd say, okay, well, they're both phenomenologists, and Heidegger too, And so you get a philosophers who would write great long theses about what's the difference between Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger and so on, and put them all together in a camp and say, well, their phenomenology maybe doesn't help us that much. It's probably better to say, well, here are some people who have some interesting thoughts to share, and let's see whether any of these thoughts will help us along. And I mean, that's in a way the strategy that I've taken, and I've always found with philosophers that I can never understand a word they say unless I've more or less thought it already out for myself already. So with somebody like Deleuze, for example, when I first opened Mille Plateau in the English, I opened this book and I thought, well, goodness me, what do I expect to do with this? It's complete nonsense. I mean, gobbledygook from beginning to end. And I can't possibly read it anyway because it's far too long and it doesn't seem to have a structure. So I put it aside and forgot about it. And people keep telling me, you really ought to be reading this book. And the reason they told me I should read it is because they'd been reading things I'd written, and they said, but this is exactly the same as what Deleuze said. And then I do read it eventually, and I said, damn it, indeed, I've gone and said everything he said already. But now I understand what he's saying. So I could only understand what he was saying when I kind of worked it out for myself anyway. And then I could translate, from my words to his and say, by this he means that, by this he means that. And then it all began to make some sort of sense. But I find it really frustrating with so much philosophical writing that they sort of start from the premise that the reader is already up where they are in their thinking, and so in some sense they're preaching to the converted that only if you're already. I mean, how do you convey a philosophical point of view, a philosophical argument, if it requires somebody to already have understood the argument in order to understand what you're saying? It's like giving somebody a map and saying that that you already have to know the. Oh no, that's wrong. That you have a map to the countryside and say, well, and unless you already know the countryside, you're never ever going to be able to read this map. So it takes you into a kind of double bind, and that's a shame because, for example, I think Deleuze in particular is saying things which are incredibly important, and especially for some fields in sciences, for ecology and biology, for example. And yet you're never going to get an ecologist or a biologist to read this stuff and understand it, unless they're way off the mainstream. So it creates a problem for us as to how we're going to make arguments which are important accessible to those who are inherently skeptical. And it's one I think that philosophers have tended to abdicate, and that I think is a shame.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's a great concluding thought, a great conclusion. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your great postscript. I really invite all the people who are part of this loop of discussion to read the postscript, to have this experience of reading it after having heard you. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, and I hope you have a fine day tomorrow with all your events.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a great day in the US. Have a great beginning of the day. Bye-bye. Bye-bye all. See you soon tomorrow.
Thank you.